Hello. This is part 2 of my long overdue video of how I made my blaster cosplay for MapleStory Fest 2024. Make sure to watch the first part if you want to see how I made the dress, the skirt, and the headpiece. I first started with very rough sketches of the weapons because at the time I had no idea how to make them. I just wanted the fingers to be articulate and that was pretty much it. For editing purposes, I'll go over each part one by one, but there was a lot of back and forth between each prop. Between crafting, gluing, painting, priming, there's a lot of waiting time when you're making a build, but there was no time to waste with such a tight deadline. I got too comfortable with my 1 month deadline. It took my sweet time sewing the dress, the skirt, and all the cute stuff for Blaster until I only had about 2 weeks left to start and finish the arm cannons. There honestly wasn't much time to think for any prop. I just had to get them done, so you'll notice that there wasn't much thought process involved into making most of these. A small disclaimer, I will name some of the products that I used as reference, but I am in no way affiliated or sponsored by them. Alright, let's get started with the belt accessories. They are made out of EVA foam of different thicknesses. I use various round objects to make quick circles. I try my best to mimic gear shapes by simply cutting different bevels and notches with scissors. There was no fancy tool here besides my handy dandy contact cement glue. I believe Lepage is a local brand. It doesn't have the strongest hold, but it is a low odor and can be used indoors, which is super convenient. Once the overall shape of the gears was done, I put them aside until I was ready to sand everything. Moving on to the headpiece, I quickly explained how I made the bow in part 1, but for the gears themselves, I bought packs of steampunk charms and superglued a couple of them together. I did the same with the feathers. It was my first time working with superglue. I think I got mine from the dollar store years ago. I still cannot believe everything held. I did sew invisible thread whenever I could to secure the gears together, and then the whole thing was sewn onto the big ribbon that I made. Oh boy, the gauntlets. I really wanted the fingers to be articulate, so a huge credit to Tinker Techie Teacher for sharing their zip tie trick to link the joints together. This whole build was about taking baby steps and just trusting the process. I wasn't sure how big I wanted the hands to be. They still had to fit in a luggage, and I didn't want an overly cartoony look to them. Once I figured out the size of the fingers, I cut them out of any small scraps I could find. I even glued some scraps together to cut them up afterwards. Foam mats are way cheaper than double-sided smooth foam, but you always end up with these awkward puzzle edges that often go to waste. I actually linked some together and repurposed a couple for the fingers. From this point onward, everything was made in under 2 weeks. Yep, while I was sewing the dress, I only work on the belt accessories and the fingers because I was dreading the weapons. When I finally started working on the weapons, I tackled the bracers first since they were the base onto which I would add the cannons. I just cut up and glued a big rectangle out of EVA foam which could easily slide onto my arm. For the raised sections, I did something similar for Kirishima years ago where I glued some thicker EVA foam onto a strip of thinner foam and then glued that thin foam onto the main structure. It sort of works, you just have to make sure to stretch the strip of foam as you're gluing it down or else the ends won't necessarily meet. I had lots of glue issues for the whole build. Like I mentioned earlier, this brand isn't really good for seams under a lot of tension. I kept having to re-glue some parts and I ended up gluing another piece of 2mm foam on top to cover up the seams that just wouldn't stay together. If you take a look at the design for Blaster's arm cannons, there isn't much aside from a couple of raised sections, some slits for some light work, and then some bevels. I found this Blaster revamp artwork from MapleStory Taiwan. I'm honestly not too sure if it's just their official artwork for the class or a special artwork of some sort, but I took a lot of inspiration from it. I decided to repurpose a lot of foam scraps I had accumulated over the years. I don't think I've ever improvised a prop as much as I have for Blaster. I had no time to think anything through and I just had to glue stuff together and hope that it would look nice in the end. I repurposed the puzzle edges again for some added texture. Anything I would cut away, I would find a way to glue it back on somewhere else. A lot of the bevels were also foam I cut away at some point and I just glued them back together at an angle. I just like to make do with what I already have, but some foam companies actually sell pre-made foam bevels and dowels. I added some googly eyes for details. They should look like rivets once painted. Once I was done with the bracers, I glued some padding out of EVA foam inside for my arm to fit snugly. Moving on to the cannons, the original blaster artwork only has one cannon, but I like how the revamp version had two, so I just went with that. I had this huge sturdy cardboard tube that I believe used to be an old fabric roll. I sawed it in two parts, one for the base of the main cannon and one for the smaller cannon. I started by covering all the tubes with 2mm craft foam from the dollar store. I literally just covered the foam sheets in glue and then slapped them onto the tubes and cut the excess away for detail work. I kept adding different thicknesses of EVA foam until the cannons kind of looked like the artwork. I am running out of double-sided smooth EVA foam rolls, so I've been using cheap floor mats you can find at almost any hardware store. They don't sand as well, they're not as sturdy, and they also have a pretty obnoxious texture that you have to sand away, but I actually like the look of it for some builds. For blaster, it was actually pretty fitting. Googly eyes are pretty convenient to have on hand. They come in different sizes and they're pretty cheap. I always buy mine from the dollar store, but they do make a sound whenever you move your props around. I also melted a couple of them when I was heat sealing my work, so you kinda have to be careful. The cannon ends were actually various bottle caps, and the cannon tips are old empty thread spools I just decorated with foam. I taped off some areas to make quick patterns and cut the details out of 2mm foam that I glued onto the spools. The pointy parts are insulation foam that I quickly carved and covered in Worbla for durability. Insulation foam is pretty brittle and melts under high heat, so it can get a bit tricky to cover it with Worbla, which is a thermal plastic. I bought one roll of beige Worbla and one roll of black Worbla almost 10 years ago, and I use it very sparingly because to this day it is still fairly expensive. I also happen to have a thinner cardboard tube in my stash. I honestly don't remember where it's from, but it was the perfect size to slide into the main cannon as an extension. I added a magnet to connect the two pieces together as well as some foam padding, but honestly, they fit so snugly I don't think the magnet was necessary. The cannon end for this one was actually a mouthwash cap. Even after the paint job, you can still see the squeeze sides while turning instructions on it. I like the idea of having different compartments and doors from the revamp look, so I freestyled some of the details out of EVA foam. It was now time to tackle the hands. This was the last prop I made for Blaster a couple of days before I had to leave for LA. To build the hands, I layered foam on top of more foam. I kept stacking foam until my hand could barely fit in the gap. I added a wooden stick covered in 2mm foam to hold onto while wearing the hands. It would also give me leverage when pulling the zip ties. I glued down spacers under and over the zip ties so they weren't flying around inside the hands. I also interlocked some zip ties together to create loops that I could grab onto more easily. Since the hands were entirely made out of foam, they would always collapse whenever I would pull on the fingers. I just needed to figure out a way to make a sturdier base. I recently acquired my sister's old tablet for which she got a new screen protector. That protector came in a slim and pretty sturdy box which I cut up to use as a base for the hands. It was pretty difficult to get the right shape for the hand. I noticed afterwards that the thumb should have been lower, but it was kind of too late to change it. I made a really big prop almost 10 years ago and the gear recently fell off of it, so I glued that onto the cannon hand and repainted it gold as per the revamp artwork. Since I didn't have much time left and I had a whole bunch of nasty seams that I did not want to sand down, I covered them in 2mm foam and tried to make a design out of it. I also used some push pins as rivet-like details and low-key, high-key put them in strategic places where I thought the glue would not hold. I would work on one hand while waiting for the glue to dry on the other one and kept doing a bunch of back and forth until I was finally done with both of them. I really like how the revamp artwork had two different designs for the hands. It definitely made the build not as tedious and more enjoyable to work on. You'll see that some of the fingers here have black spots because I actually primed the bottom joints of the fingers earlier, since at the time those were the only parts of the hands that were done. I usually keep a day or two to sand everything down. Since I don't have a dedicated sanding booth, I sand in my bathtub. To be honest, the lighting is not that great, but it makes for a much easier cleanup. For this build, I focus on the seams and battle damage. Anywhere the glue was starting to peel off, I just kind of exaggerated it to make it look like that part chipped away from wear and tear. I use a Dremel, I'm not sponsored by the way. I use a Dremel with an attachment to make it less heavy to carry around. I have chronic tendonitis and sanding with a rotating tool for long periods of time really messes up my wrist. I should definitely be sanding in short sessions, but cleaning up afterwards is just such a hassle. I tend to just do everything in one go. After sanding EVA foam, you always want to heat seal it with a heat gun so the primer and paint can stick to it better. Make sure to do this in a well-ventilated area and wear a respirator since you're essentially melting plastic. Alright, time for priming. I usually use Flex Bond, which is a flexible glue as primer, but since I have to brush it on, wait for it to dry, brush another layer again, wait for that one to dry, and so on until it is thick enough for a paint job, I decided to opt for the faster but pricier shortcut. I use Plasti-Dip, a spray-on rubber primer. It's not that cheap, but it definitely works in a time crunch. I rushed back from school, sprayed a first layer of primer outside, went back in to eat while it was drying, sprayed another layer while it was still bright outside, and then brought everything back in before it got dark. It was finally time to paint. I still hand paint everything with acrylics, and not the good quality kind. I use cheap dollar store acrylics. I did buy some higher quality paint at some point, and for most of them, I have noticed that a little goes a long way. Cheaper paint usually doesn't have good saturation, it doesn't blend well, it often looks dull, and it is more watery than pigmented, so you often end up using more compared to higher end brands. I do want to look into better quality acrylics in the future, but I would also like to invest in an airbrush kit one day. The last few days before leaving were pretty wild. I would prime, then eat while it was drying, then paint and hand sew some stuff while the paint was drying, varnish, crimp the wig while the varnish was drying. I barely had time to breathe. I've been using this brand of varnish for years now. I like the finish, but it does dry a bit tacky. The shine isn't the most natural for metal-like props, but it was the only one that I could find back then that could be used indoors and was somewhat odorless. I was told recently that the craft store I got it from now sells a very similar varnish but with a toxic label on it, which mine does not have. I honestly can't tell if they had a product recall that I'm unaware of or if they just changed their recipe over the years. I varnished the cannons, the bracers, and the fingers first because the hands were not done at that point. Once everything was sanded, primed, painted, varnished, I very professionally hot glued the belt to gears together and added some webbing loops at the back so the belt could slide behind the gears. I made sure to pack my hot glue gun since I did not trust what I did whatsoever. I had no idea how to even attach all the cannons together. I initially thought of having a screw going from the main cannon all the way through the bracer with a small washer inside the bracer to secure everything together, but I couldn't get the screw inside the main cannon. I'm not even sure if I could have done that all the way at the very beginning when it was just a cardboard tube because the main cannon ended up really thick with all the different layers of EVA foam that I just stacked one on top of the other. I ended up drilling holes into the bracers and the cannons, solidified the openings with Worbla, and inserted the screws from the inside of the bracers so they would poke out. Luckily enough, the cannons actually held pretty well. When you're traveling with cosplay, you definitely want to make sure you know your luggage measurements beforehand, which I did not. I borrowed my sister-in-law's luggage, and the day before leaving, I actually had to saw the big cannon in half so it would fit in the luggage. I used an empty toilet paper roll as a connector. It wasn't the right size, so I covered it in duct tape to add some bulk and just make it more sturdy. The wig is honestly just a mess. I actually crimped 2 wigs before leaving just in case I needed one to add volume to the first one. I initially only had this old wig from a cosplay that I never ended up making, but it wasn't the right shade of blue. So I ordered another one super last minute in a dire attempt to get a better shade match. The wig cap for that one was way too small and you could barely tell the difference in colors. I'll have to repurpose that wig for another project. I packed a black Sharpie, some dark eyeshadow powders, another grayish black, I think it's alcohol marker, and I just hope I could improvise on the go the day of. This is where an airbrush kit would have been super useful. I ended up coloring the roots with one of the markers to make the wig appear darker the day of. That pretty much sums up the whole build. I think we all know by now that I barely got any sleep working on this cosplay. I could only really work on it during the weekends since I had very limited time after school on weekdays. I would often be too tired to work on anything, but I just kept pushing. I spent 2 weeks getting ahead in class so I wouldn't stress out about having to catch up on anything once I would get back from LA. I pushed myself till degen hours on those last few days before leaving. I was generally falling asleep just about everywhere. I even had to skip out on hanging out with friends and on celebrating my birthday with them because it was the week right before MapleFest and I just had too much left to do. In the end, yes, I am proud of my work. I think I've accomplished insane things in such a short amount of time, not to mention all the repurposing and upcycling that went into this project. I work really hard on this cosplay, but I honestly don't think I have the physical and mental strength to do something similar again. Even a month after MapleFest, I was still struggling with lack of sleep. I told myself after summer break that I would try to stream again, especially during my days off, but I spent most of those days working non-stop on my cosplay or just catching up on sleep. I am proud of my work, but I can't really say the same about all the sacrifices that I had to make just to finish the cosplay on time. I definitely want to find a healthier way to balance cosplay, streaming, video making, gaming, friends, family, and just life in general. I should really stop setting all these unrealistic goals for myself. I've also noticed over the years that I always cut corners. I'll buy cheaper paint, cheaper foam, cheaper tools, and even though they do work, I could potentially avoid such an insane amount of stress just by having the right tools, like a sanding belt, a sanding booth, an indoor, well-ventilated area, a glue that actually works, a well-lit working area. I don't even own my own luggage. This was definitely a crazy roller coaster ride, and I've learned a lot of things from making this cosplay. Not so much about cosplay itself, but more about myself and things that I definitely need to work on. If you have any questions about how I made some parts, please let me know. I know I'm ending on like a pretty serious note, but I really do love cosplaying. I've been doing it for almost 15 years now, and even though I've never had the most healthy relationship with cosplay, I still enjoy it. I will link the sewing part of the costume somewhere down below, so don't forget to check it up if you haven't already. I also filmed a bunch of footage in LA, and I would really love to make a separate video about the trip, but it might take some time. Thank you all for sticking around until the end. I really appreciate the support, and I honestly look forward to making more cosplay content.